Good morning. Last time we talked about GDP and its measurement. Today we are going to make a quick revision about different methods of measuring GDP, and then we are going to talk about nominal GDP and real GDP. Let's start with a problem solving about GDP measurement. If you are given the following, net interest $200, net direct taxes, net indirect taxes 300, corporate profit 300, proprietor's income it's 150, depreciation 350, compensation of employees 1,300, rental income it's 100, personal consumption expenditure 1,500, net exports 50, government purchases or government expenditure 600, required okay, here is investment 550, required calculate GDP using the two different approaches. And number 2, calculate net domestic product. Let's start with number 1 using expenditure approach. According to expenditure approach, GDP is calculated as C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C, which is consumption expenditure, it is 1,500. Plus I is investment, 550. Plus G, which is 600. And finally, net exports, which is X minus M, it's 50. So the final answer will be $2,700. If you would like to find the net domestic product is calculated after the reduction of depreciation. So it is GDP minus depreciation, which is 3,350. So in this case, net domestic product will be 2,350. Now we are going to move to the second method, which is calculating GDP using income approach instead of expenditure approach. According to income approach, GDP is calculated as number one, summation of return to factors of production in the form of compensation of employees, net interest, corporate profit, proprietor's income, rental income. Compensation of employees is 1,300. Net interest is 200. Corporate profit 300. Proprietor's income is 150. And rental income is 100. This will be 2050. And this is at factor price, net income at factor price. We would like to convert it to be in market price, so we have to add indirect taxes less subsidies or net indirect taxes. Which is 300. This will be net domestic income at at market price. So in order to convert it from net to gross, we have to add depreciation, which is 350. So it will be 2,700. If you would like to find the net domestic product, this is the net domestic product and this is GDP. Do you think GDP using income approach should be equivalent to GDP using expenditure approach? No, they are not. In most cases, they are not equal to each other. There are differences between both of them, but it's very minor differences. It's not a huge one. Okay, this is what we did last time, as we talked about the difference between how to calculate GDP using income approach and expenditure approach. Now we are going to move to the second part of our lecture. What's meant by nominal GDP and real GDP? As we said in the definition of GDP, GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country during a specific period of time. So nominal GDP means that we are going to use the current year prices. So nominal GDP is GDP calculated using current year prices. So nominal GDP is the market value, which means price multiplied by the quantity of all final goods and services. So nominal GDP for year 2020, for example, is calculated as price 2020 multiplied by quantities of 2020. So in order to make the rule more generalized, nominal GDP for year T is calculated as price at time T multiplied by quantity at time T. So let's take an example. Let's assume an economy that produces only two commodities, orange and balls. This is the quantity produced of each one of them, and this is the price. This is the case of year 2019. Say, for example, that the quantity is 120. Price for each one of them is 1 and 5. So if you would like to calculate nominal GDP for year 2019, is going to be calculated as price of orange multiplied by its quantity plus price of balls multiplied by its quantity. So it's current year prices multiplied by current year quantities. So it's 100 plus 100, so the final is 200. So this is nominal GDP for year 2019. If you would like to do the same with respect to year 2020, for example, let's assume that the country produces the same commodities. In this case, the quantity produced of oranges is 160, and the price of each one is 0.5, and balls is 22, and the price is 22.5. So if you would like to calculate nominal GDP in this case, it will be 160 multiplied by 0.5 plus 22 multiplied by 22.5. So in this case, it will be 575. So this is the case of calculating nominal GDP. It's calculated as current year prices multiplied by current year quantities. What about real GDP? Real GDP is the value of final goods and services produced in a country during a specific period of time, usually 1 year, when valued at constant prices or base year prices or reference year prices. So this means that real GDP is calculated using constant prices, constant or base year prices or reference year prices. So this means that we are going to keep the prices of a specific year constant and just study what's going to happen to the price, the quantities. Okay, let's take the same example. Now let's assume that the reference year or the base year is 2019. So if you would like to calculate real GDP for year 2019, it's gonna be calculated as, okay, just to make the rule more general, real GDP is calculated as quantity current multiplied by price of base year. So if you would like to calculate real GDP for year 2019, it's calculated as quantity of 2019 multiplied by price of the base year, which is 2019 in our case. So it will be 100 multiplied by 1 plus 20 multiplied by 5. It's 200. So with respect to the base year, or in case of base year, real GDP is equivalent to nominal GDP, as the current year prices is the base year prices, so there is no change or there is no difference between any one of them. What about real GDP for year 2020? For year 2020, we have the quantities of 2020 and the prices of the base year, which is 2019. So this means that we are going to use these quantities and these prices. So real GDP will be calculated as 160 multiplied by 1 plus 22 multiplied by 5. It's 270. So the real GDP for year 2020 is 270, while the nominal GDP was 575. Do you think why there is a difference between nominal and real GDP? Actually, change in nominal GDP from one year to another can be divided into two main parts. Increase in nominal GDP may be due to increase in price level without any change in quantity, or increase in quantity without any change in price, or both of them. So increase in nominal GDP is not an indicator of an increase in production, but actually in order to measure whether there is an actual increase in production or not, this will be measured by keeping the prices constant. So if you are going to keep the prices constant while it change the quantity, this is a good indicator of the increase in the economic growth rate of the country or increase in the production level of the country. So from this we can use or add two more concepts. They are GDP deflator and economic growth rate or GDP growth rate. GDP deflator will be an indicator of the increase in the price level or an indicator of inflation in the economy. So change in prices can be measured by GDP deflator. While the change in quantity can be measured or reflected by GDP growth rate. So now how to calculate GDP deflator and what's meant by GDP deflator. As we said, GDP deflator is an indicator of the increase or the change in the general price level. So GDP deflator is calculated as nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. So returning back to our example, nominal GDP for year 2019 was 200, and for year 2020 was 575, while real GDP for year 2019 was 200, and for year 2020 was 270. So now we are going to calculate GDP deflator for years 2019 and 2020 and compare both of them. So GDP deflator for year 2019 will be calculated as nominal GDP of year 2019 multiplied by real multiplied by 100, so it's 100. And with respect to year 2020, it will be nominal GDP for year 2020, which is 575, divided by real GDP, which is 270. So it will be 270 multiplied by 100. $213. What's meant by these numbers? First of all, we can notice that real GDP for the base year will be always 100. So this is the base year, it's 100. What's meant by 213? This means that this means that prices increased by about 113% more than year 2019. This is the increase in the general price level, indicator of the change that has happened in the general price level from year 2019 to year 2020. So this is with respect to GDP deflator. Now we have to move to the second part, which is related to increase in production. So when we are going to talk about increasing production, so we have to keep prices constant and just to change the quantity in order to be able to measure whether there is an actual increase in production or not. So we are going to use real GDP in the calculation of the economic growth rate or GDP growth rate. GDP growth rate is calculated as usually you would like to compare the growth rate between two successive years. So it's calculated as real GDP at time t minus real GDP at time t minus 1 divided by real GDP at time t minus 1 multiplied by 100. So using our example, we have to calculate GDP growth rate for year 2020. So it's going to be calculated as real GDP for year 2020, which is 270, minus real GDP for year 2019, which is 200, divided by real GDP for year 2019, which is 200, multiplied by 100. It will be 35%. So this means that there is an increase in production in year 2020 compared to year 2019 by 35%. So once again, in order to sum up before taking an example, as we said that nominal GDP for the base year is equivalent to real GDP for the base year. GDP deflator for the base year will be 100. These are rules. Okay. Now let's take another example. If you have the following. An economy produces two different commodities, cloth and bread. Quantity and the price produced of each one of them in 2 successive years is for year 2018, cloth is 100 and the bread 500 and the prices is 10 and 2. For year 2019 is 150 and 600 and the price is 8 and 2. Now we have to calculate nominal GDP for the two different years, real GDP for the two different years, GDP deflator, and finally economic growth rate. Number 1, nominal GDP. For year 2018, it's calculated as 100 multiplied by 10 plus 500 multiplied by 2. This is 2000s. And for year 2019, it's 150 multiplied by 8 plus 600 multiplied by 2. It's 2,400. So this is nominal GDP for the two successive years. Number 2, we have to calculate real GDP for year 2018 and 2019. Without any calculation, we know that real GDP for the base year is 2018. So real GDP for the base year is always equivalent to nominal GDP, so it will be 2000s. And now we have to calculate real GDP for year 2019. So we are going to these quantities and these prices. So it will be 150 multiplied by 10 plus 600 multiplied by 2. It's 2,700. Now we have to calculate GDP deflator in both cases and economic growth rate for year 2019. So for year 2018, without any calculation, it will be 100. And for year 2019, it's nominal GDP, which is 2,400 divided by real GDP, which is 2,700 multiplied by 100. It's 88.89%. Finally, we have to calculate, by the way, year 2019 is less than year 2018, which means that there is a decrease in the general price level instead of an increase in the general price level. Later on, we are going to talk about inflation in details. Finally, number 4, we have to calculate GDP growth rates. GDP growth rate is calculated as real GDP in the current year, which is 2,700, minus real GDP for the base year, which is 2,000, divided by 2,000 multiplied by 100. So it will be 35%. So this means that there is an increase in the production or actual production of the country by 35% in year 2019 compared to year 2019. This is the end of our lecture today. Thank you and see you next week.